So what's going to talk is David talked about, buildings, books we look at. What are the references? And, and I've got tons of books, and I try to reach, and, they have so many different opinions. Thank you. You may have known that I gave a talk about The Brutalist, and that film is really interesting. There's so many styles. I mentioned that before we discovered that there were no images. And I think we ought to have a new style. We ought to call it logism. That's funny. Okay. That's funny. Okay. So, but anyway, I'm going to talk about the origins, some prominent Nashville architects, and really some select examples. Again, we talked about 1945 and 1970. I'm sorry I'm a little frazzled. It's a hard act to follow, David. And these are my selections, and it's important to remember that architects sometimes join manifestos, like something is the right thing to do. I'm going to do this. And that's particularly true with what David showed you, the modernist thing. These are hardcore people that believe in less is more, and that's it, and you've got to go with the right style. It's the correct thing to do. But as these styles are changing, some people, they could care less about the polemics. They just don't care. They like the look. And so, and what happens, of course, as World War II is over, is many projects in the mid-century are done without the architect. They're just done by builders. And Sandra will show you a lot of those examples. David mentioned the Roby House, which kind of a one-up, in 1909. And he mentioned the Bauhaus and how important it is. It really is important. This figure, Le Corbusier, was really the guy. He is really exploring the meaning, and he's convincing people that these new buildings are not only the right thing to do, but they're safe and they're hygienic. We had talked about buildings after World War II. A lot in England are built with concrete because the ones that have been built by wood were destroyed during World War II. And so the fear of fire is a big thing. So, Corbu does this house in 1927, and if you looked at it and said, when was it built? 1927. Well, that's a brand new car. And to me, that's just weird. Like, it doesn't look, that's an antique. This is a cool house, right? Well, and we have to remember these, so that's the way it happened, and David did show the most important house of Corbusier, Villa Savoie, and then sort of at the same time, Mies van der Rohe, who's representing Germany at this major fair in Barcelona, does this incredibly cool, really crisp structure. The Nazis, of course, come in and get rid of anything like that. Corbusier had done this building. I actually stayed in this building when I was in Paris, lived in Paris. And look, at one side is sort of stark and, windows in the hallway, and the other side is completely open with windows, but it's not on the ground, it's up. It's up on these interesting piers. This is a contemporary picture. That's 1931. The modern movement catches hold in America in different ways, the international style. Kind of the biggie was this building that David mentioned, the PSFS building in Philadelphia. And I want you to look close at this building. This is 1932, and it was wild for them to put these letters on top. There was a big debate, like, that's not our name. Our name is not PSFS. Our name is the Philadelphia State. And they kind of convinced, and I'm not sure who convinced who to do it. But what's really cool is how the building is arranged, particularly on the left side. You see kind of a base, and then you see a shaft, and then you see a top. If we look at the base, and this is on Market Street in Philadelphia, the base curves around. This was a bank, but now it's as David mentioned, it's now a really nice Lowe's hotel, and I stayed there. And this is like their cool bar now. And so that's gray granite on the base. It's a beautiful structure. Now Wright is still doing his projects, as David mentioned, Usonian projects, these houses, and they're really elegant, but as a style, they're really never quite embraced. if you look at the historians, they talk about there's three categories. I don't quite understand this, but international is kind of like, it holds the thing to what you saw in the Bauhaus. Really crisp, really modern, clean stuff in mid-century. Contemporary, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but the historians have said that's a very important component. But more importantly, something called organic mid-century modern. And I thought, organic, well, that means not so many straight lines, but some curves, some forms that are not quite as stark and rectilinear. And I'll show you some examples of it. It's important to note that this book came out in 1943. Fountainhead was a really interesting film, and basically the whole premise is, he's a genius. You got to go with what he invents, and anybody that does gets said as an idiot or they're stuck in the past. And even in this model, you know where this came from. It comes from Le Corbusier, which you saw earlier, and the building is clean and simple and effective. One could also say it's pretty damn boring. It's just a bunch of glass and little window frames, and other than that. But the movie takes off, and the movie really pushes that this is the genius. You have to go with things, with the idea of the really smart person. David mentioned the Farnsworth House, 1945 to 51, and David and I both love this house. Mies van der Rohe designed it for a woman who wanted a country retreat. This is not where she lived, it was a retreat. And he built it up on these stilts above ground because it's close to a river, and the river flooded all the time. Well, the river continued to flood, and it flooded the house. It got so high it flooded the house. He said this house would cost $48,000. It ended up costing over $70,000. She sued him. She sued the architect, and he ended up winning the lawsuit. No, I think he sued her because she didn't pay him, and he ended up suing her, and he won the case. But it was, in the newspapers and everything. It was a big deal. It's a spectacular place, but with it came a lot of turmoil. The same thing with Falling Rock, the famous house that Franklin Wright designed. Falling Rock, the Kaufmans that designed it, it was supposed to cost X, and it ended up costing 4X. I've told all our clients, I'm not going to do that. It's not going to be 4 times. It might be twice, 3 times, but it's going to be 4 times. And they said, they hated each other when the house was finished. David also showed this really anchored Mies van der Rohe because he was teaching at the Institute of Technology, and he's also designing their buildings, Crown Hall. This is a really seminal piece of international style or modern style that Mies van der Rohe was pushing in Chicago. Now we're talking about after the war. So what happens after the war? We've got to have places for people to live. Now, there are a lot of different experiments on how to do that, but one of the most famous is something called Levittown. It was done in Long Island. It was also done in a little town called Levittown in Pennsylvania. And what it was is small houses, very, very crisp, little simple boxes. But they were on pieces of property, and I think the size of the property had just something to do with septic systems. If you ever wonder why West Mead is so spread out, it's because of one reason: septic systems. You had to have an acre or more of land so that your septic system would work, because there were no sewers. So that's why that's why houses are on these lots and spread apart. It's not because people want to live so far from each other. It's just that's the only thing that was allowed. And so all of a sudden we have the suburbs where you have all these houses, and they're all spread out from one another. Totally unlike this neighborhood. The houses around here are close together. You have smaller yards and everything. And I think it's a much more pleasant way to live. But that's not what happened in West Mead. That's what happened out in, Oak Hill. Anyway, but some pretty wild stuff is still going on, even though these houses are, these are pretty plain Jane. You've got John Locke, who's in California. He does something called the Chemosphere. That's a private residence, but a chemical company named Kem something had, the guy worked there, so he called it the Chemosphere. And John's really talented. He does stuff like this next thing I'm going to show you. We wonder if this will ever show up in Nashville. Probably not. Pretty wild. It's 1962. When you say organic, that may be sort of organic. It's just pretty darn wild. And he's building on very difficult sites. And he's saying to people, I can design a house for you. Of course, he puts it up on poles and everything, but it's pretty cool and it works well. Much more of influence was an architect named Edward Wellstone. And you can see, this is the embassy, and to get an embassy commission is like the big thing for architects, you know. I've tried to get someone, we never got one. We got a courthouse one time, but they didn't end up building it. It got changed. But to have a federal project is really the cream of the crop. And this thing is, you know, when you're talking about crisp lines and, you know, supports off to the edge, kind of like the Barcelona Pavilion. His big thing was the Kennedy Center, which, you know, that's a big, you know, well, at the same time, now this is 1962. Down in South America is a brand new capital being built called Brasilia. And the architect that helped lay it out and helps really design their major buildings, Oscar Niemeyer. Now what's interesting, this is 1960, and you know, it's like, what are the two? Well, one is the House of Representatives and one is the Senate. And so, you know, the expression of that is pretty cool. And then the building has little connectors to it. It sort of looks kind of like the UN building, and not unlike what you saw with the Fountainhead. It was a building that had glass on two sides, but the ends were solid. So you have that. But then he does something like this. Now this is obviously a modern building, and it has the columns at the outside and straight lines, but it's very different. It's really cool, you know. Now he becomes probably the most famous architect in Brazil. What?
Is that in Brazil?
Yeah, this is in Brazil. This is in Brasilia, the new capital, which they built in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of like an agreement, like we're going to have a new capital. You know, our nation did the same thing with Washington, D.C. It was kind of a neutral spot, really, you know, not a perfect place to build a capital, but that's what it was. And so they do the same thing in Brazil. And I remember when I was a young child, I went to this. My dad went to church and they had the men's breakfast on Sunday morning before church. And if you were lucky, you got to go with your daddy. And I got to go with my daddy. Well, this guy came back and he'd been there. This is 1962. And he showed us these images. We were blown away. I mean, this thing looks like the Jetsons, right? Pretty wild stuff. And he ends up designing this. Is that exuberant? Yes. But it's not complete until 1970 because Oscar Niemeyer is a sort of socialist and Brazil had a revolution and he left the country and went to Spain. And so the building was finished after he was running out of the country, and then they built the building. So there are characteristics of this style: clean lines, some of the stuff I've shown you, right angles, some changes in elevation, usually flat or angled roofs, minimal decoration, and what that ends up being, little need for craftsmen. Well, that's a big deal. If you don't need craftsmen to do elaborate molding or stuff over your windows or stuff over your doors, they're out of luck. But this style is like, no, you don't need that. We're beyond that. That's for bourgeois. That's for the people that can afford it, and we don't need it. It's also kind of use of these new materials, which always, I think engineering is always a little bit ahead of architecture because they'll try new forms of structure and everything, but architecture is new materials, and there's a whole lot of things like Formica. Formica is a big deal, and it's very popular. Actually, thin wood paneling, plagued every house. And my parents had it and everything, but vinyl flooring and modular concrete blocks. These would be blocks of kind of decorative thing, and they were part structural and part decorative. You also got things like this, ads going on. And they're very interesting. This one is pretty wild, a plastic house, and how cool it would be. This was in Popular Science magazine, which is something I was always interested in. David had showed things like House Beautiful and other journals that probably appealed more to women than men, okay? Not to be sexist and everything, but that's kind of the way it was. And at the same time, these things are being put up. The crystals, which I always loved, the original ones, and the McDonald's, is that a mid-century style? I don't quite know, but it was very expressive. It's fun, and of course memorable. Here's an example that I really liked: a modern, cool house in Manhattan. And look at how it responds to what's beside it. Totally ignores it. right? Obviously, both classical buildings, you know, this neoclassical, whatever, and this building is so cool. And what does it have? A Jaguar. A Jaguar. And what was this thing in? Playboy. Oh. Now I'm a little guy. And sometimes we get a hold of the Playboy. Before I was 18, yeah. And I remember seeing this very well. It was these ideas of a Playboy, a bachelor's pad. How cool is that? And I particularly like this image. There he is, Hugh Hefner. Like, is this the life? Boy, that would be the life, wouldn't it? Well, because he's doing that and it's in his magazine, you know, it's like, well, that's what the guys ought to do, you know, modern house downtown. And then you have things like this, the Brady Bunch, okay? Now that's a little later, but you know, there's their house. It's like the cute house in the suburb with the big family, right? So the movies and things, they really influenced stuff. So let's see how that came to Nashville. And first of all, I have to think through a lot of things. Historians, as I mentioned earlier, they try to put things in a box. You can't always do that. And architects, they will deny it, but all architects are influenced by other architects. They're influenced by their work, by the history that they learned in school, or just copycats or whatever. And it's just part of life. And everybody's impacted if they read them, the journals and periodicals, and you kind of have to do that, like you're studying what are the new materials available, and you know, I mean, we all need to do that. But when I mentioned about the polemics and the reason you want to do something, sometimes it's just imitation. I saw that in a magazine, and that's what I like. Or even a corporate headquarters, some hot shop with a corporate headquarters. And I saw that building that Edward Joel Stone did. It's really cool. It's called the Kennedy Center. I want my headquarters to look like that. Did that happen? I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did. So what do we rely on? What did I rely on to show you some examples? And these are two important books, but guess what? They both, I mean, this is Van West. This is like the sharpest guy I know. And he left out some buildings. I can't believe he left them out. I don't know if he didn't know or he didn't choose it. The book on the left, Influential Architecture, that was a book that was done by the local AIA, and it took 1930, 1980, 50-year period. And they sort of selected notable pieces of architecture. Well, there were a whole lot suggested, but they only picked, you know, maybe 25. Well, the 25 they selected now, I'm like, oh, y'all screwed up. That's not good. But that's my opinion. Okay? So who are the architects? Well, you can go downtown and find their name. You know, 1930s is certain list. McKissick's already around, okay? Warren Holman is there. And these are kind of the older groups, particularly Warren Holman. Henry Hibbs. Henry Hibbs went to Penn also, and he was very talented, but he was kind of neoclassical. He did buildings, collegiate Gothic buildings. So in the next year, 1940s, you got, you know, the same sort of list, and some people show up. What's interesting is you see Warfield and Keeble. Now this is Edwin Keeble, but he teamed up originally with Warfield. There's Emmons Woolwine. Emmons Woolwine did the downtown Metro Courthouse, the big courthouse in front of Public Record. You go 1950, and it's more folks, and I'm sorry, it's kind of fuzzy. I just took pictures of this, and you get into 1960s, and you know, and so there's a good document. And what I found out is that Charlie Waterfield, who was somebody who was a mentor to me, he was in business with Neil Bass, and I've never known that, but he was listed, and you see these different firms listed. Now, nothing to do with architecture, but it has to do with style that's happening in Nashville. And these are just a bunch of cool buildings, but they are mid-century modern. I mean, these are all in the early 60s. It's kind of like, boom, these things hit the city, you know, car dealerships, a lot of glass, new materials, flat roof, all those things, and pretty straightforward. You know, car dealerships in addition. The farmer's market. Anybody remember the Big K? There's a Big K in 65. Another thing, remember the Zare store that was out near the airport? Well, that's it on the left. And then this is Tuscon Lanes. But notice these forms on top. Now this is a plain building, I guess it's a bowling alley maybe. But there you see this, well, where does that come from? Well, that came from kind of Brazilian, some of the other things I've shown you. So people are aware of this, and it makes it look cool, and and then you have this, movie theaters, this is the old Belcourt, and another Martin, and what do we have there? Well, that's kind of these interesting arches, but a lot of glass, flat roof. Not so much with the Belcourt. It was kind of, it's kind of dolled up. But then we look at 1965, and I'm looking at more architects and sort of trying to figure out what they did, going up into the 70s. And these are the names that kept popping up as, if I look to mid-century and try to think of firms that did that type of work, some of it, these are names I come up with. It doesn't include McKissick. I couldn't find a kind of mid-century modern design by McKissick, but I discovered one by a black architect who practiced and was at Nashville, was at Tennessee State, that just blew me away. And I hope you feel the same when you see the image of it. Now, really, this work really catches on after 1960. Most of these folks that do important buildings are early 60s and the mid 60s. Now, in 1956, there was a firm called Brush, Hudson, and Gwynn. Now, this is a team of very smart, I think two of them, one of them was educated at Yale and the other two at Princeton. And they had this little office building in 1956. I don't even know if it even got built. Their kind of claim to fame was the Divinity School in 1959, which is not neoclassical, right? It's not neoclassical, but is it modern? It's kind of hard to know. But is it different? Yes, it's different. And I consider it's probably their finest piece of work. 1959. Okay, we move into 1960. And there we get to Third National Bank that's out of Melrose. Okay, now Sandra and I will tell you that's the Neil Bass building. No. Neil Bass worked for Donald Steinbach, and he later left and formed a partnership with Charlie Warfield. Neil Bass was somebody I really admire, and he was a really good man and a great architect here. But this is like the coolest building because it has a clear story. And when it came out, there was a newspaper article about it's a bank and it has two openings on the front and on the back. So you can park your car in the back and go in, or you can go to the front door, like two entrances. If you really think about it, a bank with two entrances, pretty radical. And here's a picture of it when it was finished. And no one had ever seen anything like it. Austere walls here, but around the corner, this is the east facade. Around the corner of the restaurant is almost all glass. So when you're in it, there's plenty of light. And the clear story just lets all this natural light come in. That's fabulous. This is the way it looks now. They added to it, it's kind of mangled up, And the back side, the other entrance, the back entrance is here. Now, Donald Steinbach, I had never heard of him, but he's very influential. He did this building in West End. That I remember it's like kind of cool. Flat roof, straight lines, little decoration, horizontal windows, everything got a base. There's a decorative. Remember I talked about the decorative concrete panels? There they are. So this qualifies, I think, as a mid-century modern, 1961. A Memphis architect did this project, which is on the side of Capitol Hill, Capitol Towers Apartments. Now, it was an apartment building in about around 1998 or 99. They turned it into condominiums. And I was hoping they'd probably demolish this building because it blocks views of the state capitol. And the state is now considering still buying this project and demolishing it, which not necessarily demolition, but it has not been in the best shape. It was concrete, had these little upturned concrete balconies. Along comes this. This is John Preston. John Preston had a son named Jerry Preston. Man, you know Jerry. Jerry Preston was working for the state of Tennessee. He was our client on a lot of projects because he was my client on the bicentennial hall because his dad was an architect. He ended up becoming an architect, went to UT, but he decided to practice mainly as a project facilitator. Well, his father did this building. No one had ever seen anything like that, right? I went in it once, and I couldn't wait to see the ceiling, and it was awful. It was awful. It just looked like the upside down of this sprayed with just sprayed wool stuff. It was awful. It's not there now. They put in a laid ceiling. I went in like 2 weeks ago. And even this expression, this wall that comes out, of course, the materials are quite nice, horizontal. And then I found this, ready for this? For real, Pat Boone got into the restaurant business. A lot of people did, people get in the restaurant business for their names. And he was gonna do this, and this was an automatic place. You'd go in and order the food, and I mean, it's all automated, there's nobody cooking there. And it almost took off and then just got out. Okay, back to Nashville, the impressive architecture, I think Earl Swinson's, as he started his firm, and he worked with somebody else, they had another company, but it was an Imperial House. And this is a lot like what you saw in Capitol Hill, this kind of turn-up thing, and it's apartments. These things up high, they're very expressive. Do they really have a function? Not so much, maybe create a shield up there. But this form, very dramatic, just on one pillar. And this picture was taken, a few years ago. Unfortunately, this was demolished in 1961. Then you get this, Donald Stoll, who I really had not heard of. Robert Anderson worked with him. And Robert Anderson was very talented, later had his own firm, did a lot of houses, we call them kind of ranch, California ranch style, wood and angles and crisp shapes. But this showed up in 1963, this is Criswell House. This was built right beside Fisk. The Creswell, Ms. Criswell, was the art curator and running the American collection. And she was very well, she was not black, she was highly trained.
She was, yes, she was.
What?
Yes, she was.
She was?
Absolutely.
Sorry. Okay. Well, that's even better. She was highly educated. She wanted something different. And she was handling this incredible collection of art, like, it's an unbelievable collection. And so it's kind of cool. And she hired Donald Stoll to do this. Donald Stoll had a good firm. And we think Robert Anderson may have been heavily involved. Actually, what I read is that she asked for Robert Anderson to design the house, even though he was an employee. And that's happened before. That happened when I worked for Gresham Smith. Nelson Andrews asked Steve Tutt to design his weekend home. Steve was working for Gresham Smith, and they let him take off 2 months to do the working drawings, and then he came back. Ready for a surprise? The next one's a surprise. It's called Pagoda of Medicine. I had never seen this thing. A guy approached me one time at Rotary or something and said, I think it was Rotary, I can't remember. He said, there's this building you need to see. And it's over near, if you go up to the American Bible College and all this stuff that kind of across the river up the hill, it's very easy to find. It's right there. I almost drove off the road. Is that the coolest thing? And I'd never heard of it. I had never heard of Quincy Jackson. He was educated, as I mentioned, and he taught at TSU. He had a firm and everything. And this thing is just damn amazing. Now, I think a lot of it has been rebuilt because it looks brand new. I mean, the owners are in. I think they actually completely redone it. I'm not sure. Do you know that, Debbie?
The last time I saw it, it was in such disrepair. I was surprised. I'm surprised.
You saw it when it was in disrepair.
Yeah, and I'm astounded that it has been. I'm delighted to see this because I thought it was gone.
Well, I walked up to the window and looked in and took pictures of it and everything. They were there on a Sunday, but this is, I think, magnificent accomplishment. And it's, I showed you those books on Nashville architecture. It's not in them. Well, it's gonna be in the next one, or it should be. John Charles Wheeler went to Penn. He was not really in mid-century modern, except he did do this church that I go to church, and you kind of see these interesting loggia here that's covered. And some clear areas, crisp lines, Of course, you gotta have a steeple, and the inside, which I'm in every week, you know, it's very fun. His biggest accomplishment was the UNESCO headquarters. That's built in 1965. Now that is influenced by who? Edward Durrell Stone, right? Kind of straight line, big bold, vertical windows here, and opening here. And I've been in that building many times. I'm sad that it's been torn down. Back to Swinson, I think one of his early things, and I'm not going to show UT Nashville because that's more of a kind of a brutalist structure. And actually, Alan Cooper, who worked in Swinson's office, really designed the downtown, well, it was the University of Nashville downtown, and now it's the TSU downtown campus. But Swinson's firm produced this, the Channel 5 station. Well, where did these firms come from? Well, maybe Oscar Niemeyer, you don't know. That's 1965. Very expressive building, and you know, it's a landmark on James Harper Parkway. Now, that's Swinson. Also, you have firm Taylor and Crabtree. That's Bruce Taylor, Bruce Crabtree and Taylor. I think Bruce of the two was the designer, and their kind of claim to fame was this building, 1966, the Public Library, which later was named the Ben West Public Library. And then when Bredesen got the new library downtown, this thing was there up for sale. And fortunately for us, Hastings Architects bought the land or bought the building. I think they got a really good deal, but that's a different story. Anyway, but they put money into it, and this detailing and stuff, which is from the 1960s, I think it's just beautiful. And the lines are crisp, and I gotta hand it to the Hastings folks. You know, they spent the money to make it really look like it did. Actually, this picture, I don't think it ever looked that good new. But who knows? Anyway, again, I think this is something that we can be very proud of. I mentioned John Preston earlier. He went on to do this Parkway Towers. Not the best thing, but a successful office building. He also did, I think he did these, but I'm not sure. I think he did it because on the far side is a building downtown that's credited to Preston, and it has that big number 1 on it, First Federal. Well, this building, which is across the street from Bellevue Plaza, which is now being torn down, there's a big 1 there, and I'm thinking that could have been it. This is obviously stuff from, it has these roots and things I've shown you. It's not elegant, it's kind of, but folded plates like this were very, very, very popular. On into the 1960s, we get Brush Hushes and Windows, this tower, which at the time was the second tallest tower. It wasn't quite as tall as the L&C, and actually it shouldn't have been as close to the L&C, but Third National was out to, beat everybody else. Neil Bass is on his own in 1971 and does the Botanic Hall, which I think, most of my life has been considered, my architectural career is considered, that's one of the landmarks. Crisp, flowing areas, and so the organic thing is there. Now, Neil goes on to build what's probably his largest project, which was Olin Hall in 1974. But it's more, even though it's got this kind of wonderful curves to it and everything, it's probably more of a brutalist building, and that's because of the backside. It's all concrete. Now, I mentioned Steinball, and I never knew this, the next slide I'm going to show. Steinball was a Nashville architect. He did the building on West End. He did modern things. He did that bank building that we think was connected to Neil Bass. Well, his firm did the Legislative Plaza, and I never knew that. Now, there are 2 other names. I always thought that firm was from New York, that Mike Fitz had selected a firm from New York to come do Legislative Plaza, because it is an enormous project. You may know that it's completely being renovated, completely being changed. And well, I think the jury would be out on how they do it. But there were a lot of things that worked well, but didn't work well. There were fountains here, they always leaked, and the offices below and stuff. But I thought it was a very, very Christian. I don't know this really mid-century modernism, but I thought I'd show it to you because Steinball was involved. Less so is a guy named Henry Bledsoe. Now this is later. When I came to Nashville, I went to his office to interview, and that was the first Corten building. Corten is a steel that when you put it up, it starts to rust, but then it stops rusting, and the outer layer stays there and protects the inner layer. And that was a really cool thing to use, is core tin buildings. However, when I went out there, it looked like the core tin had been painted. And beside it is a tower that he also did in 1975. So we're up into the 70s. Now I'll save the best for last, okay? And that's it, okay? Hard to believe, 1954, he does Hillsborough High School. And really, as a kind of wrap up this discussion, his claim to fame was he really was a great designer. This was his office. Oh my gosh, I wish it was still there. It's Glen Echo Drive, I think where the post office is. Now, isn't that astonishing? And he had a whole lot of people. But of course, his big thing was the LC Tower. And you may know that I've been working with Ruby Wills the second, and now with Ruby Wills the third. We may try to do a book on Keeple's work, and it'll include a whole lot of work, but this is kind of the showstopper. 1957. The tallest building in the South was built. There was nothing taller in Atlanta, nothing. 31 stories. Spectacular achievement. And look at the base. Now remember the PSFS building that I showed you? It had a curved base, it had a shaft, and it had a top. Now, Keeble went to school at Penn in Philadelphia, and Keeble was not a fanatic about one style or another. He could really design in a lot of different styles and do it really well. But I gotta believe he had seen the PSFS building was influenced by. Although what happened is he did a better version. His tower is much better looking than the PSFS. It's more elegant, and it's elegant in so many ways. It has strong vertical lines on the north and east side, but on the south and west side, it has sunshades. Well, no one had ever done that. And he did those to just protect from the sun. And I don't think anybody said we need to do that, but he just did that. And that made the building have wonderful different sides that respond to nature, respond to the environment. And this is way before architecture needs to be environmentally safe. And these letters, and they were designed, of course, that's a big bold move like the PSFS. These incredible letters out of neon, and apparently they would be different colors depending on the weather. And I'm not exactly sure what it was, but like if they were going down or they were green or whatever, it was multicolored. They had green and red. That would tell you the forecast for the next day. And I need to look up exactly what it was. But to say this was a masterpiece is beyond belief. And this is, of course, my favorite photo, taken, before the third National Building was built and that terrible thing, the Meridian, which is next door to it. I think everybody really understood that this was a major accomplishment because, not in 1957, but a few years later they had the 100th anniversary of Life and Casualty as an organization. I think that's right. And they had a big party there. And they decided to build a big cake. This is Becker's Bakery, right down the street over here, right down the street. They agreed and they brought, a mixer because this was going to be a huge birthday cake. And there it is. And the governor and the mayors and everything, and they ate it up.
Wow.
Wow. Now that was not 1957, it was probably not 1963 or something. It gets even better. Of course, talking about a soaring structure. I didn't know about the cake. What I knew is that Carter Andrews, who is Nelson Andrews' son, approached Steve Tuck, Gary Everton, and me right after we started our firm and said, we need to do something special for the Girl Scout cookie sales. And we suggested an idea. It's where you suggest something and you really regret that you suggested. This is going to be too hard to do, but we decided to do it anyway. And that's build a cookie tower in the shape of the LC Tower out of cookies. Literally, the different types of cookies. And so we got to know the cookies because they brought in boxes of cookies so we could make the tower. And here it is. Now that's Steve Tuck and his daughter Tricia. Now our firm is pretty new. We did this in 1987. We started the firm, the three of us, in 1984. Now we built this on the upstairs area. Now there's Steve with his daughter. Okay, remember Oprah Winfrey? her sister, Carla Winfrey, okay? And Carla Winfrey was a reporter for Channel 4. She comes over and wants to do a story. She walks up and she picks up a cookie here. It was a white cookie, one of the light colored ones, and she starts to eat it. We didn't tell her that it had floor glue on it, which was cream colored flooring glue, because we were gluing the thing together, cookies with floor glue. And she ate it, and we didn't say anything. That night, there was an alarm at our office building. Steve got the phone call and went downtown, and the police were there with a guard dog. And they were afraid the guard dog was going to jump up and eat the tower. It didn't happen. It was a false alarm. This photo, which was made, I think, with some local person, this was our first national coverage as a firm. This photo was featured in Alaska, and and all over the nation, and all these people said, "God, y'all are a great firm. You're doing all this work." It's like, well, we didn't mind. And they also did it again in '97. I didn't know this. And that was the 40th anniversary of the building itself. Ending up with Keeble, I think his last work, I don't have a good picture of it, but it certainly looks cool and definitely mid-century, was a Commerce Union Bank, and we're still trying to picture, and you got it? You found one. Okay, well, she'll show it next week. I have a photo, an aerial photo, and the bank is there, okay? That's the, I think one of these buildings is a theater, and Green Hills is over there. I mean, it's just starting, but looking at a close-up. So what happened in mid-century modern? People got sick of this. Hard scale, there was a kind of pushback, and even this, we've had enough of the glass towers, We kind of have that in Nashville now with like the towers, how many can they do? But this was in 1966. Along comes Robert Venturi, who writes a book. Le Corbusier had written this book about the new architecture, toward the new architecture. Venturi writes a book, and he notices that a long time ago, Vitruvius defined architecture as having firmness, commodity, and delight. Well, what Venturi said is, the problem with that is modernists have taken firmness and commodity, and that equals delight. And he said, what happened to delight? It's gotten boring. These buildings are boring. Mises said less is more. Venturi said more is not less, less is a bore. That's a big deal. This is 1966. Princeton architect writes this. It was heresy. And then he shows up and designs his mother house on the left. Same time Robert Stern designs a house many years later. There's ornament on the house. Gasp. And it's designed at different scales and everything. This is a masterpiece, but it's only a masterpiece if you really study it. And because they were doing such weird things, and they're not purists, they were called the Grays. And against them were something called the Whites. These were 5 architects that worked out of New York City. A book came out in 1972. I have a copy of it called 5 Architects. And it showed, well, what is this? This is Corbusier all over again. This is Le Corbusier. And there are 5 architects, and the one in the middle hated it because really he's druggy. But that's original Michael Graves and Peter Eisman. And these are all like Corbusian things, and so they're called Neo-Corbusian. I know this is completely off topic, but I wanted to see because this came out in the 70s, and man, I thought this was the cool stuff. This is what I want to try to do. I think the most appropriate thing was a terminology called supermannerism. Mannerism is very important, and Venturi thought of himself as a supermannerist. Unfortunately, it got tagged as something called postmodern. Remember I showed you Crown Hall? There it goes into Lake Michigan. Now this is a thing that Stanley Tigerman, a very influential architect, did this, this collage. Crown Hall in the international style is going down. We're not going to do it anymore. Well, what replaces that? Postmodern, and that is both a good and bad. Michael Graves ends up doing things like this. It's highly decorative. You know, and Charles Moore does this great plaza that I visited, which is really cool. But it's a huge change. And if you haven't read the book, From Our House to Bauhaus, all of you seem to be interested in architecture. This is a really good book. It's hilarious. Tom Wolfe kind of looks at the whole thing, the Bauhaus and everything, and talks about how people get sick of the glass towers and they want something else. And it is a humorous book. It's not very long. But I'll end with showing you what the big change from postmodern, the real acceptance of that, is the AT&T Tower in New York that Philip Johnson did. There it is. It's got a Chippendale top. It's got kind of this interesting base shack. That was a big deal in corporate architecture to embrace something not quite so sterile and not quite so boring. And what I really like, because I had the opportunity to work in Bob Venturi's office, is that wisely, Tom Wolfe credited that. Because if you see this quote at the bottom, you know, Philip Johnson did that, but he was the real reason to take us away from rigidity and allow us to be more expressive. Now, a lot of that got out of hand with postmodern and some of the stuff I really hate. But I think Bob Venturi, who I had the opportunity to work with, he was influential to me. The Bicentennial Mall, our big plaza there, comes from this project. I mean, it just influenced. That's what I'd really like to do as an architect. And even furniture design and other things. His mother's house was on a U.S. stamp. And his work was just it's kind of flavorful and fun, not monumental, a little more loose, a little more caring, a little more loving, a little less dramatic. And with that, thank you for your patience. Okay, so questions? Let me off. Yes.
I noticed that a lot of the prominent Nashville modern style architects that you mentioned were Ivy League trained. How did Nashville become such a magnet, particularly in an era where probably Nashville was viewed as a hick town that people wouldn't want to
That's a great question, and I'm trying to give you a pretty good answer. First of all, architecture was not taught in the state of Tennessee. If you wanted to be an architect or a veterinarian, you had to go to Auburn. They had an agreement with Alabama that if you wanted to do those professions, you could go to Auburn and be trained as an architect or a veterinarian and pay in-state tuition. So a lot of architects in the 60s, the ones that were from here that wanted to go there. But a lot of people here went north. They went to Penn and they went to Princeton and Yale. Very few went to Harvard. 5 of the architects I've shown you today went to Penn. Keeble and Clinton Parent. So Penn had a strong program. Penn's program, though, wasn't really international. They were still in the Beaux-Arts phase, particularly in the 1920s and 30s. When Keeble was there, modernism was not a big deal. I mean, he was a Beaux-Arts architect, Keeble was. And he went to Europe and came back, but then I think he stayed on top of things and learned to do other things. These are wealthier people that went to the Ivy League schools. Most of them went to MBA and whatever. And it's a difficult, although several architects in Nashville went to Georgia Tech, a few went to, Georgia Tech's the one I keep seeing. Yeah, that's it. I hope that answered your question. Other questions? No, let me know. Yes?
In the area you showed of, excuse me, Levittown, the houses were not as regimentedly set back as you might expect. They were sort of varied setbacks instead of a straight line. Now the roads were straight, but the houses were kind of zigzag on their setbacks. Was there a reason for that?
A lack of zoning requirement.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to a lot of suburbs, they'll say your house has to be a certain distance off the road. And that's not good because it means the house is not close to the street, it always has to be back. But that provides uniformity with one house to the other. And I think you have that now, the zoning, the Metro's, zoning stuff, historic zoning, they're more dogmatic about setbacks and that you gotta keep responding to that. So particularly in these streets here, the houses, they kind of have the same front porch, the same distance. But it really goes back to zoning, side yard and front yard requirements, and then for our suburbs, sewer issues, about lack of sewer, septic systems. They gotta have septic yards.
That's actually a thing, when you see them vary, if you go out in Bellevue, it was, you had the lot and you had fairly lax zoning, but what drove where the house got placed was where you could put the septic
We're
system.
perked, okay, that makes sense. We're on the lot,
Yeah,
it's
you had to-
perked, yeah, okay.
Right.
Well, and that got out of hand, particularly in Williamson County. Williamson County went nuts. They were approving houses on sites that the perking didn't work, and they had a lot of problems. And now Williamson County is really dogmatic about your sewer system anywhere in the county, particularly in Franklin. It's even worse or better. Van Pond, of course, has dealt with this everywhere because he does a whole lot of residential work. All right, David Payne, you're leaving me out. Okay.
What you're asking for a question?
No, I was asking you for a question for me.
Yeah, well,
You're speechless?
It was so complete, yeah. I'm stunned. I don't know where to start.
That's a different answer.
Yeah, it was so complete, I just have nothing.
Did Edwin Keeble design several churches around here?
Yeah, and I didn't touch, I didn't touch on this. Keeble made his real fortune and prominence before the L&C Tower doing churches. And he did Woodmont Christian, he did the Vine Street Church, and all of them had these little steeples and they were called Keeble's Needles. Because they were so, and the one, Woodmont Christian is like drugs. It is so tall, it's crazy. But he was very good at that, and he was comfortable with different styles.
Yeah, and I think in the, particularly Vine Street, it's a classical but modern.
Well, it has Doric columns on the front with indices and everything.
Yes.
And on top is a stainless steel cupola, stainless steel tower.
And the walls are virtually all glass. The nave walls are,
Yeah.
well, I would say like 60–70% glass. There's
Yeah.
huge windows.
Natural with no stained windows, stained
Yeah,
glass.
it's a cool building.
He did the downtown First Baptist, and I think that was not a strong effort, but he was, and of course, he did so many homes. And when we try to do our book, we're gonna try to show the variety. But I need to emphasize, he was not judgmental on a certain style. He was just really good. and I just admire that talent. And with the L&C, he just knocked it out of the park. Just it's glorious. And I think it is the equivalent to the state capitol in the 19th century. It's the L&C Tower in the 20th century. I just feel that strong about it. It's so well done, so dramatic. And just like the state capitol, when it was built, was the tallest building in the South. L&C, when it was built, tallest building in the South. Strickland came from Philadelphia. Keeble went to Philadelphia, learned in Philadelphia. Yes.
So what about the back building? I'm surprised you haven't mentioned that.
Let's not talk about
Is
that.
that a bad, did I bring up a bad subject?
Why would I mention it?
Well, I don't
Is
mention
it-
it.
Is it modern? I mean, I don't.
What do you say, Kim? It's just god awful.
I'll let David. I think a redeeming quality
It's air conditioned.
is that unlike many buildings downtown, it's unusual enough that you notice it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
As opposed to so many other towers downtown that are glass boxes.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah. Two buildings, I would love to know your commentary on Tennessee Tower and how that fits sort of in this, and Aladdin Industries.
Okay, that's a good one. Those are very good ones. Aladdin Industries was built out on Murfreesboro Road. I knew Victor Johnson and his son, and that was fabulous. I only have a couple of images of that, and I would say they do qualify as sort of mid. It's terrible because it was torn down, but he had the factory that was against Burger Road, and then he had his office building, which had those expressive columns on the outside around the edge that go up. And then, in fact, I drove by it 2 days ago. I probably should have included it. Tennessee Tower is another thing. That was done by SOM. Keeble wanted to do that project, and I think other architects wanted to do it, but they wanted to hire SOM, the big shot firm.
They sent the B team.
What?
They sent the B team.
Well, no, I don't think so, David. I think Gordon Munshaft was involved in it.
Well,
It's just, it looks like towers that did all over the world. They were very crisp buildings. They had pronounced area in the front of the building. That's the most expensive office building ever built in Nashville. Is the American General built, well, the National Life building that now the state owns.
Yeah.
State got it for a great deal, but it has escalators and terrazzo floors. I mean, it is a wonderfully done building. Problem is the travertine started falling off the side of the building, and SOM got sued because the subcontractor used carbon bolts instead of bronze or stainless steel bolts. It's exactly the same thing that happened with the city court building in New York City. Both could have fallen down, but really, this one wouldn't have fallen down. It's just the panels kept falling off. And I remember they scaffolded the whole building. This is, this is the National Light building. And so anyway, it's a very, and I think it's 1967 was when it was done. And it was taller than the LLC too. It was built as the tallest building. Yeah. Any other comments or any concerns? Yes.
Who was the architect on the Batman building?
That's Earl Swince's firm. Swince's firm is kind of like a lot of firms like Gresham Smith. They have evolved. It started small people, 5 or 6 people, got to be big, got to be really big, really big, really big. And one of the challenges of that, what I'll show you, who did what in the firm. I know Alan Cooper was Squinson's office. He had graduated from MIT, and he really did the downtown Nashville campus building. The TSU was originally University of Tennessee Nashville downtown campus. It's influenced by the Boston City Hall in a wonderful way. I think it's a spectacular building. It's not mid-century modern, it's more brutalist because it's all concrete. But other firms, and we've discovered that. I think we're really gonna struggle with Keeble because he worked with someone else when he started his career. And so, who did what? And it's hard to find the documents. I know in our firm, with Steve and with me, one of us was a lead designer, and the credit would go to the lead designer, even though we'd argue and stuff, and I'd have input on his projects, he'd have input on mine. But we kind of wanted it that way, if we did it, we signed, that's our puppy, that's, we put our energy into it. But firms don't always do that. Firms come along, they get bigger, they have medical work, they have hospitality things, and they grow, and they make a lot of money, and they provide a very good service. And I think that's the case. We have a lot of really, really good architects in Nashville now. We always have. Van Pon's the one you ought to hire. Did I answer your question? Yes.
Just in defense of the Batman building somewhat, the first floor interior atrium is a wonderful, it used to be a wonderful respite or refuge from the hurly-burly of downtown.
If you say so.
I don't, well, no, not if you're looking for refuge, from the heat and the noise and all that. They had water features and plants, and they high maintenance. I don't know if they kept it still. It's been over 10 years since it's been there.
I think so, but I'm not
But
sure.
it was a nice place to go and chill, if you'll forgive me. Some of us need to chill out every now and then.
So the air conditioning that he said.
Yeah, well, the air conditioning worked, yeah.
You nailed it, didn't
Yeah.
you? Any other questions? Well, listen, y'all have been really patient. I'm so sorry about the screw up. That's my fault. I downloaded the file to the wrong file, and I got here early so it would all work, and then it didn't work, but I got here, and I'm sorry about that. Everybody has a glass of wine. Drink it all up. I'm sorry for the cheapy cups. That's all I could get at the liquor store. David, it's like Christ Church.